Okay, welcome. We are continuing our discussion of Descartes with Meditation 3. Now, for those of you who have been reading along, you might notice that Meditation 3, in many ways, is weirder and harder than what you found in Meditations 1 and 2. My main recommendation as a philosophy teacher when you encounter a difficult reading like Meditation 3 is to stick with it and don't stop reading if something is hard or weird or difficult. The main thing you want to do when you're reading a philosophical text that is hard or weird or difficult is to keep pushing through, and instead of trying to understand what is meant by every single sentence, try to see that you're getting the main point. And I will also then help guide you along and flag some really important points that will hopefully then, on a second read, help some more of the points in the reading snap into focus. One important thing to remember for Descartes is it's really important to think about the order of each claim that Descartes is making in the text. So something that's claimed in Meditation 1 might make sense in that place, but it will not still make sense in Meditation 6. And things that Descartes is saying in Meditation 6 wouldn't make sense in Meditation 1. So we've got to be thinking about the order. So let's think about what we know so far. In Meditation 1, we get this method of skepticism from Descartes. Right? He's looking for some knowledge that is lasting in the sciences. He wants something that we can not doubt at all. We're looking for indubitable beliefs, and he wants to use these as a foundation for other beliefs and for the sciences. Right? So we're looking for certainty, and we're looking for a stable foundation for our other beliefs. And the way we find a stable foundation is we sort of set up the highest standard of skepticism that we can. This, for Descartes, is the evil genius hypothesis, where not only are we doubting our senses or whether anything exists outside of our mind, but we also doubt our capacity for rationality. Meditation 2, Descartes then discovers, well, you can at least be sure that you exist. Not even the evil genius or the evil demon could make you wrong about that. And then he goes on to argue in Meditation 2 that we are essentially thinking things. You don't know that your body exists yet. You do know that your mind exists. Descartes infers from this that your body is inessential to yourself. So he's going to say instead, the essence of your mind is thinking. Whereas when we think about body, he thinks that when we really think about it, the essence of a material being is to be extended, to take up three-dimensional space. And when he gets to the passage about the wax at the end of Meditation 2, he seems to be saying that we know our mind more closely and more directly than we know our bodies. All right, so part of what we're going to do in Meditation 3 is give an argument for the existence of God. At this point, all we know at the end of Meditation 2 is that you yourself, your mind, exists. If this is all we could prove, then we'd be in a position that's sometimes referred to as solipsism, right? The solipsist believes that the only thing in existence is their own mind. Right? So Descartes in Meditation 3 is going to show that something other than his own mind exists, right? And he's going to prove the existence of God. Now, this argument for the existence of God in Meditation 3 is strange and complicated. So I'm going to give you a partial understanding of the argument, where I'm going to fill something in with what I'm just going to call feature X. And then after that, I'm going to have to explain a bunch of concepts and mechanisms going on in Descartes' metaphysical theory, that is, his theory of reality. And once we have this metaphysical theory, then we'll be able to talk about what I'm going to call feature X. So here's how Descartes is going to argue for the existence of God in Meditation 3. First, he's going to say that everything that is real has a cause. Another way to put this is that nothing comes into existence for no reason. He's going to say, my idea of God is a real thing. He's not saying that God is a real thing, but he's saying that, when you're thinking about God, there's a real thing that's called your idea of God. Just like you can have an idea of unicorns, or an idea of a sunny day, or the idea of a coffee mug. So ideas are things. And then he says, the cause of my idea of God must have, and here I'm just going to call it feature X, right? So there's something that Descartes is going to say is special about our idea of God. And then he's going to also argue that God himself, we're not talking about the idea anymore, but the actual being. He's going to argue that God is the only possible being that could have feature X. So now he's going to say, look, my idea of God must have an explanation, just like everything has an explanation. And moreover, the explanation must have certain features. And then he's going to argue that God is the kind of being that has the features that could explain the existence of your idea of God. So he's going to say, therefore, God's existence must be the cause of my idea of God. So in other words, we're going to extrapolate the existence of God himself from reflection on the nature of our idea of God. So, as I've already said, of course, this argument needs further explanation. So we're going to ask, what is this feature X of God, which uniquely explains what my idea of God is like? Okay, so that's the broad outline with this mysterious feature X left out. Now we're going to have to do what I'm going to call setup work. Descartes' going to give us some concepts, some basic metaphysical ideas that he thinks you're just going to have to accept as obviously true. Another way that Descartes will put this, and he hints at this idea at the beginning of Meditation 3, I think he really follows it through in Meditation 5, so we're going to save full discussion for it later, but he's going to say these are going to be clear and distinct ideas, or clear and distinct perceptions. So he's going to try to get us some logical truths that are completely obvious and self-evident to Descartes, and these are going to lead us to the idea that God could be the only explanation of our idea of God. All right. Now, here's an important idea for Descartes. He's going to say we need to think about the concept of what a substance is, right? And here's how Descartes is going to put it. A substance is a thing with existence, and it's existence that's independent of anything else, right? So think about this coffee mug that I'm holding in my hand. This is not a thing with independent existence. We might say this is not a self-sufficient being in a certain sense. It's made of clay and glaze. And really, it is a composite object made up of material substances, right? So we might say that this thing depends on the existence of the materials that make it up. We might also say a substance is that which modes or accidents depend on for their existence. More metaphysical explanation, but the idea here is that a mode or an accident is a way that a thing is. So for instance, you might have a rock, and this rock could sometimes be cold when it's sitting outside in the winter, and it could be hot in the summer when the sun is shining down on it, right? And we're going to say, look, there is substance that makes up the rock, all the material matter that forms it. But then we've also got modes and accidents that can only exist insofar as they are a way of being for that rock, right? So we might have things and their transitory features. Right? So things that aren't a transitory feature, but the thing that a transitory feature inheres in. So we've got things, we can call those substances, and then we've got modes and accidents. And those modes and accidents are ways of being certain kinds of substances. Another example, not only do we have material substances, but we also have mental substances, right? So in meditation 2, we learned that the mind is a substance, right? And we can also realize that there are different ways of having a mind, right? Because sometimes, I use my mind for thinking in one mode. That might be thinking about metaphysics. But sometimes my mind does other things like desiring to eat a burrito, right? So we might say your mind is a thing that exists on its own, and then it has different ways of being a mind. Sometimes it thinks about metaphysics, sometimes it desires a burrito. Okay. So here's a next move that Descartes is going to make. He's going to say a substance has this independent existence. It's going to be there in a way that doesn't depend on the existence or actions of other things. But we're going to say that a mode, like the rock being hot, so the hotness of the rock is dependent on the substance that makes up the rock to exist. Now, here's the idea that Descartes is going to have. He's going to say that the mode, the heat of the rock, is kind of less real than the material that makes up a rock. So he's going to say the hotness of the rock is less real than the thing that makes up the rock. Because not only does the hotness come and go, but the hotness also depends on there being a substance for the hotness to inhere in. It's a strange thought, but we might think, look, the more independent the existence of a thing is, the less contingent its existence is. And we might say, if something is less contingently existence, we might say it has more of a basis in reality. It's not just a fleeting transitory thing. Now here's a next move. We've got this distinction between substances and modes. Substances are more real than modes. Well, Descartes is going to also claim that God, if God exists, God is going to have the most reality. He's going to say that God is the only thing that exists necessarily. He's going to say that God created you and me and all of the material world. But at the end of the chain, God isn't created by yet another thing. If there was yet another thing that created God, then, the thing that got created wouldn't be God. It would be some sort of sub-deity, if anything, or it would just be yet another finite substance. So Descartes is going to call God an infinite substance, and he's going to say that God is an infinite substance because God exists necessarily. If God exists, God is going to exist necessarily. That is, God doesn't have to be created by anything else, but God is something that just has to exist, wasn't created, but has just existed for all time and will exist for all time. Right? Whereas you and me, and so you are a substance and I am a substance, and the material world is made up of material substance. But these things are the creations of God, right? They could stop existing. They could be poofed out of existence. In meditation 2, Descartes is even willing to say that not only does God create us, but in keeping us in existence, the preservation is really just another way of talking about creation. So God is creating you and the material world anew in every moment. Right? So this is the way in which God is a necessarily existent being. You are only a contingently existing being. All right, a bit more conceptual work. Descartes gives us this concept of formal reality. Now, when Descartes talks about formal reality, he's just talking about something's being existent in reality. Okay, so we're going to say that, look, God has the most formal reality as an infinite, necessarily existent substance. You and me in the material world have less formal reality. We are actual, we exist, but we don't exist necessarily. We exist contingently, and the material world exists contingently. Right? So we're going to say we're real, we exist, but we're not as real and not as permanently existent as God is. Right? And then we would say below that, we have the modes and accidents of various substances. So, the accident that my mind is currently thinking about eating a burrito, well, that's a transitory desire. That's even less real than myself, right? Or we might say the hotness of a rock is fleeting and transitory, also dependent on the substance. So it has even less formal reality than a finite substance. So we're getting this picture from Descartes of what kinds of things there are. There are substances and there are accidents and modes. And within substances, we have finite substances. And then we also have the infinite substance, which is God. Now, here's another strange concept, and I find that it's a strangely named concept for what Descartes is actually talking about. But he's going to tell us about the concept of objective reality. Now, he's going to say that objective reality is a feature that does not apply to actual things in the material world, right? So my coffee cup that I'm holding in my hand is not an idea. It's a thing, right? So Descartes is going to say that because objective reality is a concept that only applies to ideas, it would be a mistake to talk about the objective reality of this coffee mug. Instead, we're going to talk about the concept of objective reality as applying to ideas. And we're going to say, well, you can have ideas about different kinds of things, and you can think about different things in different kinds of ways. So here's the idea. He's going to say that the objective reality of your ideas depends on the reality of the thing represented in your idea. Now here's the idea. Here's the thought. Ideas about infinite substance have the most objective reality. Right? So when we're talking about objective reality, we're asking the question, what kind of thing are you thinking about? Well, if you're thinking about the thing that is most real, then your idea has the most objective reality. Ideas about finite substances have less objective reality than our ideas about infinite substances, right? So he's going to say in a certain way, your ideas about the material world in your own mind are about less. Ideas can be about things, right? So we're going to say that my idea of my own mind is about less than my idea of God, which is an infinite substance. Right? When we talk about an idea being about something, it's just based on this observation that ideas represent certain kinds of things, right? So when I am desiring a burrito, I am having a thought that is about burritos. When I am thinking about my coffee mug, that is an idea with what philosophers will call an intentional object, right? I am thinking about a certain kind of thing. So what Descartes is telling us here is that the idea of an infinite substance is about the most real kind of thing, whereas our idea of a finite substance is about another kind of thing, but it's about something a little less real. And then finally, we could say the idea about modes that you might have has the least amount of objective reality. So here Descartes is saying, like, look, hotness, it's very easy to think about it like this. It's not actually a thing in and of itself, right? He points out, for instance, that it's very easy to think about hotness and coldness, both of them as things, right? But in fact, they're not both things. In fact, coldness is an absence of heat, right? So when you're thinking about coldness, you're thinking about a mode, right? A way that a substance can be. And we're going to say you're not really thinking about a thing when you're thinking about coldness, right? You're just thinking about a mode, a way of a substance, a way that a substance could be, right? So we're going to say when we use this measure of objective reality, which is a measure of what kinds of things our ideas are about, we're going to say our idea of an infinite substance has the most objective reality. Our idea of a finite substance has sort of like a medium amount of objective reality, and our ideas about modes have the least amount of objective reality. So here's how Descartes puts it. If you go to page 106 of our anthology, Descartes is going to say, those ideas that display substance to me are something more, and if I may say so, contain within themselves more objective reality than those ideas which represent only modes or accidents, right? So here on 106, what Descartes is claiming is he's saying that really ideas about substances are about more, that is, they display something more, right? If you're displaying substance rather than a mode, there's more to that idea. And the way that he uses the term, that means that the idea of a substance has more objective reality than the idea of a mode. Okay, so now we've got this idea, we've got substances, both infinite and finite, and then we've got this idea that our ideas can be about these different kinds of beings. Well, then Descartes is going to give us what we could call the causal rule. And the causal rule is going to say there must be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect, right? So you can't, get effects poofing into existence from nowhere. And he's also going to say you can't make a more real thing out of a less real thing. So he says you can't make a substance, a thing with its own independent existence and reality out of modes, right? So you can't, for instance, make material substance out of hotness and weight and motion, right? Because those are modes or accidents of a material thing, but you can't make substances out of modes. In fact, it's the other way around, right? Modes depend on substances forever existing, right? So you have to have at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. Now, another way to think about this is you cannot create, not only for things, but Descartes is going to say, you can't create an idea of an infinite substance by mixing together ideas of many finite substances. So now we're in the realm of ideas. Here's one way to think about it. You can't think about infinity by adding together a bunch of finite things, right? If you just keep on adding all the numbers you've ever heard of together, you're still not really thinking about infinity. You're just going to be thinking about a really big number. The other way that we distinguish between infinite substances and finite substances is this distinction between necessary existence, which we find in infinite substances, as compared to finite substances, right? So you can't get the notion of necessity by mixing together a bunch of contingent things, right? Because necessity just means has to happen, and contingent sort of means might, maybe, could happen, right? You can't take a bunch of maybes and string them together or add them together and get a must, right? So you can't create the idea of an infinite substance by mixing together ideas of many finite substances. Now, here's what Descartes tells us, and thus natural light makes it clear to me that ideas exist within me as certain images. So what he's saying here is that, like, look, an idea is kind of like an image in that it represents certain kinds of things, right? So on my poster up here, there is a picture of the moon in this poster, right? And we would say that this picture of the moon is an image of an actual thing, the moon, right? And then we're going to say, given that certain images are representing things, they're going to fall short of the perfection of things from which they're derived. So it is true that like all of the detail and importance and scientific significance of the moon, we can't capture all of that in a picture of the moon, for sure. But an image or an idea cannot contain anything greater or more perfect than those things do. So again, if we talk about like scientific information, it couldn't be that this is a picture of the moon that contains information about it, and getting more information out of the picture than the thing itself, right? So he's basically saying here, the image or the idea of things, well, the thing itself is going to be sort of like a constraint on how much information we could actually get into what is represented in an image or in an idea. Now, remember, we've already got this big idea that infinite substance is more real than finite substance, right? God exists necessarily, whereas the material world and our minds exist only contingently. So that's the way in which it's more real. We're also going to say that modes are less real than finite substances, right? These are passing transitory features of things like minds or the material world. Now, we can then go on to say, you can't create an idea representing finite substances from modes, right? So it's not like I can get an idea of independent existence by mixing together modes like motion and greenness and hotness, right? And he's also going to say, and you can't create an idea representing infinite substances from either finite substances or modes. So you can't build up the concept of God just by thinking about your finite and imperfect mind, nor can you build up a concept of God from the material world, nor could you build up an idea of God by thinking about things like modes, hotness or greenness or being in motion. So this is going to be the kicker. The only thing that your idea of infinite substance could be traced to is infinite substance itself. So the only explanation of how we're thinking about a necessarily existent being that wasn't created but always has to exist, well, the only way that we could actually come to have that idea is if there is an actual entity with that feature of being necessarily existent. So earlier in the video, I gave you the setup, right? If my idea of God has feature X, then God is the only possible being that could have that feature, and therefore God must explain, by existing, the existence of your idea. Well, now we can fill that in, right? We're going to say that your idea of God is about something. It has the maximum level of objective reality. And we might say that this idea of God must have the maximum level of formal reality as its explanation, right? Now we're also going to say God is the only possible being that could have this maximum level of formal reality, and therefore, if God is the only thing that could explain your idea of God, then that is the only possible explanation. So therefore, God exists. So that's how we get the argument for God's existence from Descartes in Meditation 3. It's a strange proof, but in a certain sense, once we have an idea of his notion of substances, objective reality, and formal reality, then we would say he's giving us this idea that only one thing could explain our idea of God, because there's only one thing that could exist eternally and necessarily and for all time. Now, I think that there is a challenge that remains for Descartes. Not a whole lot of people have been persuaded by this argument, as intellectually dazzling as it might be. The thing you need to notice is that Descartes' proof of God in Meditation 3 is only going to work if there's no alternative explanation of where our idea of God comes from, right? And as he goes on in Meditation 3, this is why he insists he has a positive idea of God's infinity as the perfection that all imperfect things fall short of. So he's not just saying that, we have an idea of perfection by thinking about all the imperfect things in the world, which then gets us to the idea of perfection. In fact, he goes the other way around. Descartes thinks that we have to have an idea of perfection and necessity first, and that's going to get us to the idea of imperfection and contingency. Now, this idea that we can only have one explanation of where our idea of God comes from, this is also why Descartes argues that our idea of God cannot be made up or gotten from the senses, right? He claims that either we can get our ideas from the random chance of experience. He calls this an adventitious idea, right? Some ideas we make up, like a chimera, which is some mixture of, cats and lions and eagles, right? But he's going to say that, our idea of God is not something that we can just add or subtract things to like we do with a chimera. But he says it's an immutable and unchanging idea, right? And he says that the only possible explanation that he can come up with is that God imprinted the idea of God into him. So for instance, towards the end of Meditation 3, he tells us that the idea of God is kind of like the mark of a craftsman that you'll sometimes see on a finely crafted good, right? So he's going to say that we can see the work of God in the very idea of God that he places within us. It's like a craftsman's mark. So these are the strategies that Descartes is going to take up. And I'll note, not everybody has been convinced. Maybe you can come up with an alternative explanation of where Descartes got his idea of a necessarily and eternally existing God comes from, that doesn't appeal to this idea that, well, it has to be about a necessarily existent being. And we'll notice that other philosophers, so Hobbes in his objections to the Meditations, and about 100 years later, Hume, they will both argue that oftentimes when we think about our idea of God, we have what we might call a negative idea of God's infinity. So it's not that we're thinking about infinity and necessity and perfection itself, but instead we're just thinking about things that are finite and imperfect, and then we just negate those finitudes or imperfections, right? So we might call this a negative infinity because it says, well, what is it to be negatively infinite? Well, the negatively infinite thing is the thing that we think about, being in existence for a short amount of time, and then we just think, well, what if it doesn't stop? What if it just keeps going? That's how we think about infinity. And we're going to build up that concept of infinity from finite things and our ability to negate things with our imagination. Now, whether that competing explanation is going to work against Descartes' argument, that's ultimately up to you to figure out. But hopefully, by looking at these broad strokes in Descartes' argument, we'll have a clearer sense of exactly what it is that's going on in this sometimes strange and bewildering proof for God's existence that appears in Meditation 3. In any case, thanks for listening.